in the methodology topic that I'm going to talk about today, there are many approaches. There are different approaches to your research, and therefore, if you are pursuing one, if you're adopting one approach, you clarify that in the ethics form and only provide the instrument that you will use. So that is the explanation for that. Any other question from anybody? Please go ahead and ask. Okay, I also have a question about the data collection for the questionnaire analysis. Should the data we collect for this research portfolio be used as actual data for final dissertation later? Or is it just a small sample to demonstrate our skills? For the dissertation portfolio, you do not need to collect data, okay? You do not need to collect data. At this stage, all we want you to do is to identify your topic, to be able to justify why the topic is relevant, why you are undertaking the topic, that is the research gap. So after establishing the background, you should be able to establish your research aims, research objectives, and research questions. And then you should have a literature review section. And at that point, what you need to do is just provide methodology, a section on methodology. Okay, so this is generally what I have for my students. So let me try and share this with you so that you may be able to see what I'm talking about. So for the proposal stage, so this is what I expect you. So here you have the title, introduction to the topic. You have the research questions and the research aim. Research objectives, as I said, there should be a maximum of 4. And then you have research objectives, also 4. Okay, then you have a literature review, and it should be, as I explained earlier, there you are drawing on the paper that you have downloaded, you have research on the topic, and you are critically engaging with what others have said. And we've provided samples of literature review on the system, on the Moodle page. Again, you will have a section on methodology. So there, all you need to do is provide the research philosophy. And again, at this level, and I will add, I'm going to talk about research philosophy today in detail, but I will add that you don't need to go into very, very extreme detail at this level for the research philosophy. Remember, your word count is just, it's 2,000. So what at this stage in terms of proposal, you just need to talk about, introduce the research philosophy. If it is a positivist approach, you talk about that. If it is an interpretivist, you talk about it. You can talk about the two. It's either interpretivist or positivist or pragmatism. And then you just highlight why. Then you talk about the types and source of data you collect, the data collection methods, and the instruments that you will use. Okay, so here we are saying it's either a survey questionnaire or it's an interview instrument. And then you talk about the methods, why you've adopted the particular methods, and why you have decided not to. For example, if you're doing quantitative, for example, you may decide that you will use t-test, you will use regressions, you may use correlations. So whatever one you want to use, or you can use descriptive statistics as well, or charts. But yeah, you can use charts and graphs to present your data. And again, you need to talk about potential ethical considerations. So that is what you need. You don't need to collect the data at this stage. And then you move on to talk about provide a Gantt chart, okay, which is what we call the plan of work. And I covered that yesterday in detail. So highlight the research plan and the timelines. And then, of course, you need to reference your work appropriately. So that's pretty much what I use as a guide for students in terms of dissertation proposal. It is only after you have finished the literature review that you will go and collect data, okay? That is when once your supervisor, they allocate the supervisor to you, and then you start working with the supervisor. That is when you prepare, you work with the supervisor. They'll look at your questions again, your questionnaire, and say, okay, that is fine. You can go ahead and collect the data. Then you go and collect the data, but don't collect data for a proposal. A proposal is not the work itself. You are only presenting, you're proposing what you're going to do. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Good. Any other question, please? Okay. If there is no question, then I will move on to today's session. Okay. I have a question about the research question. We just need to put it in the introduction, proposal stage, or throughout the later dissertation. Okay. Remember what I said. So the proposal stage, you put the research question. You will later on, once you submit, and on the 7th or 17th of April next month, the next thing is you will then start writing. You meet your supervisor and you then start developing your dissertation. The proposal will then be redeveloped into your chapter 1, okay? And so your chapter 1, which is the introduction chapter, should have the similar thing. So it will have introduction and the background studies. It will have the research problem. It will have the research aim, objectives, and research questions. And then it will have a bit of the discussion of the literature, and then you have structure of the dissertation. There you will not have a plan. You will take away the plan, but you will then have something like a structure of the dissertation. Okay, so you will then present that. You take away the methodology. You present the methodology and the research ethics in the chapter 3. Okay, and you present detailed literature review in chapter 2. But the rest of the proposal will be presented in chapter 1, including the research aim, objectives, and questions. And so it's at that point that you will state the research question. Maybe you can restate the research question in methodology chapter to explain, just to provide a background to why you are selecting certain approaches to enable you to answer the research question. You can also restate that when you've presented your findings, and then you are discussing the findings, just to show that you have answered the research questions. Okay, maybe you can address each research question individually, or you take each research objectives. So, but you don't need to restate it throughout at every stage. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other question? All right, then let's move on to today's topic, which is the research methodology. So what we've done over the past 3 days has been to look at the identification and development of the research topic, the development of the research problem and the research aim objectives, and then the research questions. We've talked about how to review literature, and I've given you ideas about how to at least identify and scope your literature, and how to critically evaluate the literature and present that literature, how to desist from describing the literature, but making sure that the literature review is much more critical and integrative. And we talked about research ethics yesterday, what it means, some of the principles and the codes of research ethics, why it's so important, and the fact that you need to make sure that you complete the research ethics forms and attach it to the proposal as your research portfolio. So the forms and the templates are all on Moodle, so make sure that you access them and complete them along together with your proposal. So in a sense, you need to have consent forms. You need to have consent forms for the respondents. You need to complete the ethics form in itself and consent forms, and so access forms. So all those need to be included so that we know what your thinkings are and that your research will be in line with the principles, research principles. Okay. So from there, we want to look at how you're going to collect your data and how you're going to analyze the data. Now, research methodology is about going out to collect the data. Now, you always use research methodology as synonymous, or if you want, for example, if you are considering preparing a good meal, you need the ingredients. You can't sit down and describe how a good meal is made, but you would need to go out to the market to buy the ingredients, to prepare, come and then cut them together, mix them in the right proportion, and then cook it or steam it or roast it or bake it, whichever way you want. So there are different approaches or different ways of cooking the food, or there are different type of ingredients you get to prepare a particular meal. So depending on your topic is the same. You have to think about how you are going to collect your data, what type of data you need to collect, and how you are going to analyze the data in order to yield the results, okay, to the right result that will address your research questions, that will address your research objectives. Okay, so research methodology, as the name suggests, is the study of the methods to help you resolve the research problem. It is the science of learning the way research should be performed systematically. Okay, so in order to do that, you have to justify, and in considering the type of methods to use, you always have to justify why you are adopting a particular approach. So as Anne may have suggested, if it is quantitative approach, maybe you want to collect data on impulsive buying by consumers and the role of online platforms or the role of offline platforms in facilitating impulse buying. You can determine, maybe use quantitative, and that is a questionnaire, and you have to design it in such a way that you can appropriately code the data in the right way so that you can be able to establish or analyze, run either your regressions or correlations appropriately. So it is a process that needs to be followed, and all the assumptions needs to be met. You need to think about reliability and validity issues throughout the whole process, so that at the end we can hold your results and say, okay, this is valid. Okay, you've gone through a valid and reliable process, and therefore the information, the results you got is credible. It's credible. So normally we use, if you look at Bell has and his colleague, they've used Saunders and Itals too. They've used this research onion as as an example to demarcate the various aspects of a research methodology which you would need to cover. So usually it starts with the research. It starts with the research philosophies, and for the methodology chapter, that will be the first thing. After the introduction, you will need to think about the research philosophy. There are a number of research philosophies, starting from positivism, interpretivism, critical realism, postmodernism, and pragmatism. So if you look at the onion here, it tells you that if you are focusing on positivism, it will show you, if you go down that way, I hope you can see my cursor. From positivism, if you are cutting through positivism into the middle part, into the middle circle, you will see that positivism aligns with what we call deduction. Okay, you collect quantitative, you analyze, and you deduce from it. Okay, you deduce from the results. Again, it is more quantitative. Okay, you could use mono method or so it's more quantitative there. And again, you are using, for quantitative, you are using things like surveys, and to collect surveys, cross-sectional or longitudinal data collection. So you start from explaining positivism, deduction, quantitative approach, and then what type of quantitative instrument will you use? Will it be questionnaires, surveys, or will it be data that is already there that you can use? And then would it be just a cross-sectional, a one time snapshot? If you're using something like interpretivism, which are the two areas I would focus on, particularly at this level, it is more about induction, and then it's more about qualitative, and then you have, in qualitative, you then have either case study, you have interviews, you have grounded theory, and then so on and so forth. And the data can also be cross-sectional, which is a one-time interviews that you collect from, or a longitudinal, whereby you collect the interviews over a period of time. So the research onion, if you follow it properly, logically, it helps you understand how the various types of methodologies or approaches that you can use. So at the outskirts, you have the research philosophies, and then the next step, you look at the research approaches, which is deduction, induction, and abduction. And then following that, it is the research design, whereby you're looking at the approaches. Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Is it mixed method? And so on. And then in terms of the tactics, the research tactics, you're looking at the, also research design, you're looking at case study and so on and so forth. And then the tactics, you're then looking at things like, okay, either surveys and so on and so forth. Then in the middle, you also have things like access. How do you access it? And what are the ethical issues? The sample size, the selection, the data, the collection, and the analysis. So those are some of the tactical issues to consider. And you need to select each of them appropriately. So pretty much what we're going to be talking about this afternoon will be along all these areas. Once you make decisions on your methodology, you have to select, and you cannot just select an approach without justifying it. It has to be justified, and you need to make sure that the approach you're using, the philosophy, the approaches, the research design, and the tactics you're using are all geared at helping you address your research questions and the research objectives. If, for example, you are talking about how to examine the impact, the relationship, the association, then you're looking at positivism, you're looking at quantitative approach. But if it is more about providing explanations of a phenomenon, okay, understanding why maybe why people engage in impulsive buying, then you want to understand the reasons, the meanings, okay, why, the rationale, and that again require something different, which is the interviews, or which is case studies, which is observation, and so on and so forth, which will require kind of text, and that text you will then analyze. So I will start with the research philosophies. There are quite a number of them, but I would want at this stage to emphasize on just a few of them. Yes, at every level of dissertation or thesis, so undergraduate, postgraduate, DBA, MBA projects, and then PhDs, at every stage you need to cover research philosophies, and therefore it's important to understand research philosophies. And the research philosophies is pretty much looking at how knowledge is developed, and the nature of that knowledge. The nature of that knowledge is always anchored on what people believe in terms of the value of that knowledge, in terms of whether knowledge generated through numbers or through text are valid or are generalizable. And so there are various assumptions that guide the explanation of or determination of what knowledge is and how valid or valuable that knowledge is. So for every researcher conducting a particular research, their assumptions in terms of what constitutes good knowledge, reliable knowledge, will influence the approach they take to designing their methods of collecting data and analyzing the data. Okay, so it helps them to decide whether going quantitative approach, mixed method, or qualitative approach is the best way to generate the right amount of knowledge, okay, to generate knowledge that is valuable, that is credible, okay. And there are a number of research philosophies. We have the ontology, the epistemology, and the axiology. Now, these three major philosophies are linked together, okay? They are linked together, and they only explain people's assumptions in terms of what constitutes knowledge. Okay. So for ontology, ontology is pretty much concerned about the nature of reality. The nature of reality. Usually, researchers will think or will wonder what type of information or approach would explain reality. Okay, will better explain what is real, what is reality. Okay, and there are two main aspects to that. The first aspect, which are always in two polar opposites. The first one is objective examination of a nature, objectivism. So it tends to suggest that that social entities exist in reality external to social actors concerned with their existence. Okay, and so which means that events or issues exist in themselves, and that no matter what you do, you will arrive at that knowledge, that understanding. Okay, in an objective assessment, you will arrive at that answer. So there is reality that exists external to a social phenomenon. But the second part talks about the fact that nature, that reality is not actually objective, it's subjective. Okay, reality is based on people's perceptions, it's based on phenomena, it's based on what happens within people's activities, people's decisions. And therefore, it is a consequent actions of those social actors. Okay, and that is what they consider as real knowledge. And if you see, when you talk about objectivism, it's always associated perhaps with natural sciences, where they take objective assessment of a situation. Okay, and at times numbers are used, at times data, quantitative data is, that's predominantly what it is. It aligns with to assess the objective nature of an issue, and that is considered to be reality. On the other hand, other researchers consider reality to be based on subjective examination of a situation based on the interactions of social actors, that is people and institutions. It is through the interactions that reality is generated and knowledge is generated. For epistemology, it is more concerned about the legitimacy of the knowledge that is generated and how that knowledge can be communicated to others. Okay. So if you look at it, it aligns to some extent with the ontology that I talked about, which sees knowledge in terms of reality as based on objective assessment of a situation which is external to social actors, people. Okay, the reality exists irrespective of actors, what social actors are. But in epistemology, here we are looking at what is acceptable, the validity, the legitimacy, and reliability of the knowledge that is created. And there are always two aspects to it, two main principles. Okay, positivism and then interpretivism. And positivism, again, aligns with the doctrines of natural sciences that knowledge, legitimate knowledge or valid knowledge is based on objective assessment, as talked about in the ontology, is based on objective assessment, okay, of numbers using to validate knowledge and to legitimate, to test issues and then to test phenomena and to validate and to communicate that knowledge to others. But in the opposite end of it is interpretivism, which is pretty much based on things like subjective interpretation of phenomena, of social events. Okay, and it's again aligned to the subjectivism aspect of the ontology. So pretty much if you are, at this level, what maybe I can emphasize is to ensure that you understand each of these and explain briefly what philosophy you are, what philosophies you understand, and why you are selecting a particular philosophy. So under the epistemology, either you are using a positivism or interpretivism. So at this level, what I would say is, if you're using quantitative, just think about it, go back to the research onion. You will see that it is, on the ontology aspect, it is very much aligned with the objectivism. Okay, objectivism, philosophical leanings. And again, with the epistemology, it is pretty much aligned with the positivist approach or positivism. If you are going to interview or using a qualitative, then you are adopting something along the subjectivism of the ontology angle. And then again, with the epistemology, you are adopting the interpretivism, because you have to interpret the interviews data that you collect. You have to interpret it and make sense of it. Okay, you have to transcribe and interpret by coding, by doing thematic analysis, and then it's true that you will make sense of the text or the information that you have gathered. So again, epistemology looks at the legitimacy of knowledge, okay, legitimacy and validity of knowledge. And the opposite aspect is positivism associated with quantitative, that is natural science techniques, where, in the sciences, things are, examined based on natural facts, based on facts. But in social sciences, it's more about people's opinions, people's views. Okay, and that is much more in line with interpretivism. Okay. So for the epistemological leanings or positions, then we have the two extreme. So positivism is more quantitative, more about natural sciences, more about validating knowledge or facts, establishing, testing, maybe testing hypothesis and all that. Interpretivism is more about explaining, finding explanations to a phenomenon, okay, and getting texts or explanations from other people to try and then find answers to a phenomenon. Pragmatism is where people tend to mix the two. Okay, we use mixed method, so you add the quantitative and the qualitative. They call it pragmatism. Okay. And they adopt the best approaches of the two. So in terms of positivism, as I explained, it is used by the natural sciences. Research approaches that employ empirical methods. They make use of quantitative analysis, okay? Use logical calculations to build an explanation to an issue. So the researcher will set objectives, objective analysis of the situation using quantitative data, which will help them. I mean, at the end, once they've tested and they've come up with their findings, maybe the impact, and they confirm something, then with that, they can generalize. For example, if somebody undertaking a research on the role of the impact of online platforms on impulsive consumption, you have to measure the online platforms mechanisms, and then you measure also the impulsive buying. And through quantitative data, you can determine what is the impact, or does it really impact? So once you are able to validate that, then you can generalize it in every situation, in every phenomenon when it comes to impulsive buying. But if you want to understand the why or how people engage in impulse buying from online platforms, then that one you are trying to find explanation, a bit more explanations. That is different from the establishment of facts. Does it have an impact? Yes or no? It confirms. So it makes a detached interpretation about the data that have been collected in an objective manner, and therefore the researcher is independent of the subject of the research. The researcher does not affect the subject of the research, and the researcher is not affected by the subject of the research. So people take their responses, and then those are coded into numbers. Those are coded into numbers, and then analyzed. And the researcher has no input in that sense, in terms of the data or the interpretation. So the focus is highly structured methodology, using questionnaires to facilitate replication, so that same method can be used in any part of the world. And the understanding is that once it's an objective assessment, you will have the same answers or the same results in many contexts, subject to perhaps a proper, should I say, a proper approach to conducting it. And it can always be replicated. So observations can be quantified. This permits statistical analysis. So when you're doing statistical analysis or you're doing a quantitative analysis or data collection, you're adopting the positivism approach. So think about it again in terms of the ontological perspective. You are adopting, if you're using positivism, it is more of the objectivism angle. If it is epistemology, then you are looking at the positivism aspect of it. But if you are using interpretivism, which is the next one, interpretivism is the opposite, okay, where the researcher plays an important role. It's a bridge in between the social actors. Okay, it emphasizes the differences between conducting research among people rather than objects or issues. And therefore, it is the role of the researcher to interpret the situation, to interpret the phenomenon. And at times, using that, not even at times, it's always difficult to generalize because you're not using the natural sciences and it is contextual. It's based on social actors or people's views and feelings in a particular context. Okay, and so with interpretivism, it again aligns with qualitative explanations, people responding to interviews or case studies or focus groups, where you as the researcher, you are listening and your perspective also counts. At times when you're analyzing, you also have your personal views in terms of how the data is coded, and that is also aligned with the subjectivism aspect of the ontological perspective. Okay. So interpretivism is used to understand motives, actions, and intentions of people or situations. Now, pragmatism holds that the most important determinant of the epistemology or ontology or axiology adopted is the research question, and therefore it is only relevant where they support the action. So pragmatists, they tend to focus on the research problem, and they tend to use both objective or subjective, that is maybe a mixed approach to doing it. So they are more interested in the practical outcome than just focusing on what is the valid answer in or what is the nature of knowledge. Okay, so that is pragmatism. And when it comes to axiology, then axiology is pretty much focusing on the role of values and ethics, within the research processes. It incorporates questions about how research deal with their own values and the values of research participants. Okay, so the choice of the philosophy indicates or reflects the researcher's values. It indicates the researcher's values. Okay. So as I explained earlier, when you look at the philosophies and when you are writing your proposal, you need to at least explain some of these things. And I'm hoping that you are understanding the differences between these philosophical angles. Do not spend hours upon hours writing them. Just understand it and provide a brief summary explanation of the research philosophies and which of the philosophies that you are adopting and why. If you're using a quantitative approach, it's of course you're using in terms of the ontological perspective, you are using objectivism. In terms of the epistemological, you are using positivism. But if you're using interviews, qualitative, then in terms of the ontological perspective, you are using subjectivism. In terms of the epistemological dimension, then you're using interpretivism. So that is just what you need to clarify in there to let us know that you understand a bit. So each of these philosophies are further explained here and they're differentiated. So for the ontological dimension, it is more about the nature of reality. Okay, nature of reality. And the focus is that reality is external, independent, and it is the same reality everywhere. In terms of epistemology, but it can also be, so that is the objective aspect of it. In terms of the epistemology, the focus is either on scientific observation or where causal explanations are provided, where knowledge is generated and generalizable, and these explain the positivism aspects. In terms of axiology, it is more about the values of the researcher. So if you're pursuing the natural sciences approach, where reality is considered to be true, that is universal, applicable everywhere, then it means that there is no value, the research personal value attached to it, and therefore it is value free. The researcher is detached or neutral to the phenomenon. And so with all these, if you're adopting this approach, either the objectivism, the positivism, and the value-free approach in axiology, then usually you will have that study using what we call deductive approach, highly structured questionnaires, large samples. And I told you, was it yesterday or the other day, that when you're using quantitative, which is in line with all these, I mean, the positivist approach, you will need not less than 100 responses, valid responses, to be able at least to generate acceptable results that can be generalized. Anything below 100 is not good enough. Okay, it's not good enough. So it relies on measurement, typically quantitative. Method of analysis is usually, you can use descriptives, but much more inferential statistics like correlations and regressions are absolutely fine. There are many others, and I'm sure you may know others, but as long as you are able to do that quantitatively to determine the validity of knowledge or the reality of knowledge, that is in line with positivism. or objectivism. Okay. In terms of interpretivism, as I explained again, is based on the influence of, the values of the researcher is involved in terms of the axiology. On the ontological aspects, it is seen that reality is socially constructed. Reality is based on interactions of people and phenomenon and society and context. And therefore, reality is not a single factual statement or episode or something that can be established and generalized. And therefore, you have things, let's say, approaches that are based on people's understanding, people's explanations, people's views, people's perceptions, and then the researcher also puts their own interpretations, the whole process in terms of the axiology. And this approach is always reflected in methods such as interviews. It's typically inductive, small samples. There you can have maybe 15 or 10 to 15 at this level, 10 to 20 is fine. Responses is fine. So interviews, qualitative methods, and the sufficiency or the reliability of the information is determined based on what we call data saturation. So if you interviewed about 10 people or 15 people or 18 and 20, and they start to repeat the same information, you start to get the same responses, then it validates the answers and shows that there is nothing new for you to obtain from additional responses. And therefore, that will be enough. And you use you use those interviews or those case studies to analyze and then present your findings. So for pragmatism, pragmatism is kind of a mixed in between interpretivism and positivism. Okay, it's more complex, rich data and external. Reality is practical consequence of ideas. And then usually they view that true theories and knowledge are those that enable successful action. Okay, so they focus on the problems, they focus on practice and relevance. And it is value-driven research by the researcher. So the researcher initiates it and sustained by their own beliefs, their own doubts, and so on and so forth. So here, they normally, in terms of approaches, in terms of methods, they normally use mixed methods, multiple methods, qualitative and quantitative, action research, and so on. So those are the research philosophies. Those are the research philosophies. Make sure you understand them. Explain briefly in your proposal. In your dissertation, you will need to write about them. Okay, you need to explain a little bit more about them, because 8,002 for the whole dissertation is not enough to delve so much deep into all these. When you compare them with a PhD, that may require students to write about 80,000 to 100,000 words. And so they can spend a lot more time delving into these philosophical orientations. But in this case, make sure that you understand each of them and you justify why you have adopted one approach, okay, one philosophy. And so again, going back to the research onion, you will see each of these philosophies and how they align with the research approaches. Okay. Now, in terms of research approaches, we usually have deductive and inductive. Okay, deductive and inductive. So as I explained here, you see, when you're looking at positivism, it's more deductive. Okay, it's more deductive. So there, a deductive approach is concerned with quantitative piece of work. Okay, so you want to deduce from analysis from your analysis, and as a result, quantitative studies tend to develop what we call hypothesis, as I explained the other day. Okay, based on existing theory. So in the deductive approach, you adopt a theory to guide your study, and then through your literature review, you justify what, or make argument, or cover what others have already done about what has been done, the ideas that have been done, or the arguments or the findings that have been generated around that topic, around maybe the relationships and the lack thereof, or the conflicts, or should I say, the different findings that have emerged from the examination of those two variables or number of variables, which may look at how the level of impact of one variable on the other. So in this case, if I go back to the impulsive buying and the offline and online, you may look at the impact of offline marketing, or online promotion, or online offline platforms on impulse buying, and also measure or test the impact of online platforms or marketing on impulse buying. You could also look at the impact of sustainability practices on impulse buying. Maybe some people who value sustainability very much may be influenced to buy just when there is anything associated with sustainability. And so you measure each of those variables, and you collect your data, you run them through, check all the reliability, ensure that goodness of fit tests are all checked, all the metrics, assumptions are all fine, and then once you do that, you test your assumption, your hypothesis, by randomized regressions, and if the results comes out that there is a positive impact, it could also be a negative impact, or it could be there may not be an impact at all. And you will then deduce from the results that, okay, this association is significant, which means online platforms have a positive impact on impulse buying, or sustainability initiatives, or focus on environmental protection influence people more to consume particular products, and so on and so forth. So it has been stated that deductive means reasoning from the particular to the general. That's right. So if a causal relationship or link seems to be implied by a particular theory or case example, it might be true in many cases. Okay. So a deductive design might test to see if this relationship or link did obtain on more general circumstances. So it is always used. You will always have hypothesis tested in that. Okay. So that deductive approach, very much aligned to objectivism, very much aligned to positivism approach, and is pretty much aligned with quantitative data collection methods. Okay. The opposite to that is what we call the inductive approach, where researchers rather induce knowledge, reduce explanations to a phenomenon from the data that they have collected. Okay, so they develop the understanding and they build theory out of it. Okay, so for them, for the inductive approach, it's more about subjectivism. It's more about interpretivism. So they interpret and the reality based on the information that they've obtained. So it helps them understand the way human build their world, permit alternative explanations of what's going on, of a phenomenon, and is always concerned with the context of events, maybe in a particular industry, maybe in a particular country or region, and it uses more qualitative data, and you can use different data collection methods. You could have observations, case studies, focus groups, interviews, semi-structured or unstructured or structured interviews, all of them, to collect the right data to analyze. Okay. So deductive emphasizes on scientific principles, moving from theory to data. It focuses on the collection of quantitative data, the application of controls to ensure validity of data, as I said. It focuses on operationalization of concepts to ensure clarity of definition. So conceptualization for each of the concept of variable, you need to conceptualize it, operationalize it, identify items. That's what we call skills or scale items. People validate those scale items as an operationalization of the variables. And until the scales are validated, usually you have problems, and that's why in those in quantitative, that is the deductive approach, there is so much emphasis on validity and reliability. It's highly structured approach. The researcher is independent. Researcher independence of what is happening or what is being researched, and there is a necessity to select sample size that is sufficient, good number of responses, okay, in order to generalize the conclusions. So not less than 100 sample at this level. When it is maybe around the masters, maybe we can be going to 200 PhDs. You're looking at 400, 500, 1,000, 2,000. But if you can, the more you can collect data, quantitative data or responses, the better it is. Always the better your results. Inductive emphasizes on gaining an understanding of the meanings of humans attached to events. Okay, it provides close understanding of the research context. Okay, either within a particular industry, a particular group of firms, maybe SMEs, maybe construction industry, maybe depending, or electric vehicles, whatever context you are looking at. The collection of qualitative data, it's always focused on qualitative data collection. And it's more flexibly structured to permit changes of the research as the research progresses. So there is also the realization that the researcher is part of the research process and is less concerned with the need to generalize, but to provide explanation and understanding of the situation within that particular context. So you can see the three main types as measured against other concepts like logic, generalizability, the use of data, and the theory development. So deduction, induction, and abduction. Deduction is pretty much based on generalization, collecting of quantitative data to evaluate hypotheses based on an existing theory. And the aim is to generalize, to generalize, to verify, to validate, or to falsify a theory. But for inductive approach, it is more about inference, providing much more explanation to generate untested conclusions within the context. Is generalizing is pretty much specific to that industry in that context, and it's difficult to generalize broadly. And data collection is always pretty much based on qualitative, to explore a phenomenon using teams. You identify teams through thematic analysis or patterns to create a conceptual framework. Remember what I said yesterday. So for quantitative or for the deductive approach, you can develop your conceptual framework in the literature towards the end of the literature review to show the variables, to show the association or the predicted associations of the variables, which you will then test in order to validate and generalize. In the inductive process, qualitative process, there you present, you analyze your data, collect the data, analyze it, and the teams that have emerged, you can then present them create a conceptual framework to try to present them in a diagrammatic way to show the implications of each of those teams. And at times, some studies can use those frameworks to later on then develop quantitative study to test those some of the variables or the teams that have emerged from that. And then abduction is where researchers use logic to generate a testable conclusion. So they generalize from the interactions between the specific and the general. And this data collection is used to explore a phenomenon, identify themes and patterns, and locate these. So it's similar to the inductive, and it's also based on theory generation, modification, and so on. Okay. So for the adaptive, okay, yeah. Let me finish this one. Give me the last 2-3 minutes so that I can finish the research approaches, and then we take a break. Is that okay? So give me 2 more minutes. So for the adaptive approach, again, also referred to as adaptive, is set to address weaknesses associated with the deductive and inductive approaches. So it's more or less used in kind of mixed method approaches. It's a third alternative to overcome the weaknesses of both inductive and deductive, and that is where they use the pragmatic perspective. Okay, the pragmatic perspective. So in choosing your research approach, you need to ensure that you think about how you're going to collect the data, what kind of data you need. Okay, that helps you to identify, to make the right decisions in terms of the philosophical dimensions or orientation. Okay, the right choice of approach will help you to make a more informed decision about your research design. It will help you to think which strategies will work for your research topic. It will help you to adapt your design to cater for any constraints. So the research, your philosophical angle will clarify a lot of things. As I explained, I think whether yesterday or the day before, I supervised some students sometime where they were pursuing either interpretivism or inductive approach, but they tried to develop hypotheses within the deductive, and which was a bit confusing, and that will always affect the quality of your dissertation. So you need to make sure that you are selecting the appropriate philosophies and the appropriate research approaches that align with the philosophies. Okay. All right. On this note, I will pause here and give you 15 minutes break. And then around 12:45, we will start again. Okay. So I'll see you in 15 minutes.
Recording stopped.